She has been married to the same man for nearly 30 years, a partnership most people would call the definition of a happy ending, the kind of steady, decades-long devotion the tabloids rarely get to write about. And yet, at 81, Dame Helen Mirren has quietly named a different man as the one she never fully let go of, a love from 40 years earlier that she has said, in her own words, she will carry until the day she dies. It isn't a scandal, it isn't a regret, it's something far more honest than that. So before we get to what she actually said, let's go back to where Helen Mirren's story began. Long before Buckingham Palace, long before the Oscar, back when she was just a restless girl with a complicated last name and no interest in playing by anyone's rules. Helen Mirren was born Elenia Lydia Mironoff on July 26, 1945, in Hammersmith, London, into a family caught between two very different worlds. Her father, Vasily Petrovich Mironoff, came from Russian nobility, descended from a line that had once served the Tsar, while her mother, Kathleen, was a working-class Englishwoman from the East End, whose own family had ties to service in Queen Victoria's household generations earlier. It was, in its own strange way, a household stitched together from two opposite versions of history. Her father worked as a cab driver and played viola in an orchestra to make ends meet. And during the Second World War, with anti-Russian sentiment running high in Britain, and the family wary of how a foreign-sounding surname might be treated during wartime, they quietly anglicized their name from Mironoff to Mirren, so it wouldn't cause problems for them at a difficult moment in the country's history. Helen grew up in that household, describing herself, only half-jokingly, as having been raised anti-monarchist, a detail that makes everything she'd go on to achieve decades later feel almost impossibly ironic. She spent much of her childhood in Essex alongside her cousin Tanya Mallet, a girl who would later become a Bond girl herself, and by her late teens, Helen had already found the thing that would define the rest of her life. She joined the National Youth Theatre at 18, then the Royal Shakespeare Company a year later, throwing herself into Stratford productions with an intensity that quickly caught the industry's attention. Her talent was obvious enough, early enough, that a documentary filmmaker built an entire film around her called Doing Her Own Thing, broadcast on British television while she was still cutting her teeth on stage. By 1974, she was playing Lady Macbeth on one of the country's biggest stages, and a year after that, she took on the title role in The Roaring Girl, a performance one critic described as a singularity of purpose, capable of holding both light and darkness in the same breath. She was building a reputation as something rarer than talented. She was becoming unafraid, on stage and off, in an era that didn't always know what to do with a woman like that. Even when she stepped away from a production entirely, colleagues later said she somehow remained the most important presence in the room, simply by the standard she'd already set. That fearlessness carried straight into her personal life, and nowhere more vividly than in the summer she still describes decades later as one of the most formative of her entire life. In 1967, just 22 years old, and still years away from film stardom, Helen fell into a relationship with a Jewish boyfriend who invited her on what would become one of the defining adventures of her youth. The two of them traveled to Israel not long after the Six-Day War, hitchhiking across the country together with nothing but a shared sense of curiosity and no real plan beyond seeing where the road took them, before settling in as volunteers at Kibbutz Ha'on, a collective farming community near the Sea of Galilee, spending weeks picking grapes and working in the communal kitchen alongside strangers who quickly became something closer to family. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous, hands-in-the-dirt experience a rising young actress with a comfortable career trajectory had absolutely no professional reason to seek out, and that's precisely why it meant so much to her. The romance itself didn't last long past that summer, but the trip stayed with her for the rest of her life, resurfacing in interview after interview decades later, long after most people would have let the details of a single youthful boyfriend fade into background noise. She has described the experience of that month as something close to magical, a formative brush with a complicated, resilient part of the world that never left her, and she has said she is amazed every time she returns, even now, by how much of that original feeling comes rushing back. Decades later, when she was cast to play former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in the 2023 biopic Golda, Helen pointed straight back to that summer as part of what drew her to the role, an emotional through line stretching from a 22-year-old picking grapes on a kibbutz to an 80-year-old headlining a film about one of the most consequential women in the country's history. In an almost unbelievable twist that surfaced during the film's press tour, genealogists later discovered that she and Meir were, however distantly, actually related, a connection nobody involved with the project had even suspected going in. It's easy to look at that Israel trip now and see the blueprint for everything Helen Mirren would become, a woman who chased real experience over comfort, who trusted her own instincts over convention, and who never let a relationship's ending erase what it had taught her. That same instinct followed her straight into the next decade and straight onto the set of a medieval fantasy film in Dublin that would introduce her to the second great love story of her youth. In 1980, Helen Mirren was cast as the sorceress Morgana Le Fay in John Boorman's Excalibur, already a respected 35-year-old actress with a decade of serious stage work behind her. Also on that set, playing the knight Gawain, was a 28-year-old, completely unknown stage actor from Northern Ireland named Liam Neeson. He has told the story many times since, standing beside his close friend and co-star Ciarán Hinds, watching Helen walk toward them from 100 yards away in her full Morgana costume. He admitted plainly, "I was smitten." He later added a smaller, funnier detail to the story too, admitting that before they'd even worked together, he'd once read that Helen had a habit of secretly imitating the walk of any man she fancied behind his back, and one day he turned around and caught her doing exactly that to him. Helen, sitting right there beside him, decades later, hearing this for the first time, burst out laughing and said, "I never knew that. You've never told me that before. That's amazing." What started as attraction on a film set turned into something real almost immediately. The two moved in together and stayed together for the better part of 5 years, splitting time between London and Los Angeles, with Helen, already the more established of the two, quietly using her own industry knowledge to help Liam land his first agent and start building the Hollywood career that would eventually make him a global action star. Helen has never downplayed how serious that relationship actually was. Decades later, in interviews she gave well into her 70s, she described it plainly.
"We didn't date," she said. "We lived together." And Liam quickly added that they were a serious item for a while. And when the subject of Liam came up again in a conversation with AARP, the magazine, she didn't hedge at all. "We loved each other," she said. "We were not meant to be together in that way, but we loved each other very, very much. I love him deeply to this day. He's such an amazing guy." In the same conversation, she went even further, saying flatly that she will love Liam until the day she dies. That's not the language people usually use about an old boyfriend from 40 years ago. That's the language people use about something that never actually finished, even after the relationship itself did. Liam has echoed the same warmth from his own side over the years, once telling an interviewer that he considered himself lucky just to have spent those few years with a woman he called really something else, and that riding horses in shining armor while falling in love with Helen Mirren was about as good as life ever got for him.
The two eventually drifted apart in the mid-1980s, reportedly in large part because Liam wanted the chance to build his own name and career without being seen as the boyfriend of a much more famous actress. It ended without bitterness. They've reunited warmly on television more than once since then, including a memorable joint appearance on The Graham Norton Show, where Liam recounted the story of that first meeting on the Excalibur set all over again, and Helen, hearing the details of just how smitten he'd been for the first time, could only laugh and say she'd never known any of it decades after the fact, calling it amazing that he'd kept the secret that long. Neeson went on to marry actress Natasha Richardson in 1994, a marriage that ended in tragedy when she died following a skiing accident in 2009. Helen, for her part, was already building something else entirely by then, a partnership that would end up outlasting almost everything else in her professional life. She met American director Taylor Hackford in 1985 during her audition for his film White Nights, right around the same time her relationship with Liam was ending. They began dating the following year, and unlike her earlier romances, this one didn't burn fast and end young. It grew slowly over more than a decade before the two finally married on December 31st, 1997, in a small ceremony in the Scottish Highlands. Helen was 52 years old. It was her first marriage, and Taylor's third, and by her own account, she'd simply never felt the need to rush toward the altar, the way earlier generations of women were expected to. She has said that her intense, formative loves in her 20s and 30s, unresolved as some of them were, taught her exactly what she wanted and exactly what she didn't, and that patience is a large part of why her marriage to Taylor has lasted for nearly 30 years now, well past the point most Hollywood partnerships even survive. She once mentioned, almost as an aside, that she used to sew custom shirts for the men she dated as a kind of personal tradition, one she kept going through her relationship with actor Peter O'Toole, through her years with Liam, and straight into her marriage with Taylor, a small, handmade thread of continuity running through every serious love of her life. It's a quiet detail, but it says something about a woman who has always measured devotion by small, private gestures rather than grand public ones. When asked years later whether Taylor still made her feel beautiful, she answered with the same dry, unbothered honesty that has defined her entire career, joking that beauty was never really the point of what they had together in the first place. While her personal life was settling into its final chapter, her professional life kept climbing in directions nobody could have fully predicted for a woman raised to distrust institutions and titles. Helen built a reputation through the 80s and 90s, playing complicated, formidable women, most famously Detective Jane Tennyson, across 7 seasons of Prime Suspect, a character whose exhaustion, ambition, and quiet fury reshaped how women in law enforcement were portrayed on television entirely. She earned an Academy Award nomination for her supporting turn as a devoted head housekeeper in Gosford Park in 2001, proving she could anchor an ensemble just as easily as she could carry a lead. By her late 50s, an age when many actresses found the industry's best roles drying up completely, Helen Mirren was somehow just getting started. Before filming even began, in the lead-up to what would become the defining role of her career, Stephen Frears' The Queen, chronicling the royal family's private reaction to the death of Princess Diana in 1997, Helen wrote a personal letter to the real Queen, unsure of the correct form of address and genuinely nervous about what she was about to attempt. She later said she told the Queen plainly that the film would be investigating a profoundly painful period of her life, and that she hoped it wouldn't be too awful for her to watch. While preparing the role, Helen has described picturing the monarch almost like a submarine, with her eyes acting as a kind of periscope, a woman constantly observing the world from behind a controlled, careful exterior. She studied hours of archival footage, kept photographs of the Queen in her trailer throughout filming, and wore jewelry on screen modeled directly on pieces the real Elizabeth actually owned, including Queen Victoria's own bow brooch and Queen Mary's pearl earrings. Crew members on location later described moments where Helen, still in full wig gown and makeup between takes, would draw quiet, almost involuntary stares from bystanders who weren't quite sure for a second whether they were looking at an actress or the monarch herself. When the film was released in 2006, it earned Helen the Academy Award for Best Actress, and it reportedly earned her something even rarer, a personal invitation to a private dinner at Buckingham Palace, a gesture few actresses portraying a living monarch could ever hope for. Helen ultimately had to decline, tied down by a prior filming commitment in South Dakota. She couldn't move, and she said publicly through her representatives that she would never have the rudeness to insult the kindness of that invitation, only the plain impossibility of being in 2 places at once. Years later, reflecting on whether the Queen had ever actually watched the film herself, Helen admitted she'd never know for certain, only that she'd gotten the sense, somehow, that it had been seen, and that she had been appreciated, a small, private confirmation, she said, she would treasure, without ever needing it spelled out loud. That role alone would have secured her legacy, but Helen didn't stop there. She remains the only actress in film and television history to have played both great Elizabeths of the English crown, Elizabeth I in the 2005 miniseries of the same name, and Elizabeth II a year later in The Queen. She went on to add Queen Charlotte in The Madness of King George, and Catherine the Great in an HBO miniseries to that same unofficial collection, becoming almost by accident the definitive screen portrait of royal womanhood across 4 centuries of British and European history, a body of work no other actress has come close to matching. It's a strange kind of legacy for a woman who once described her own upbringing as vehemently anti-monarchist, raised by parents who would have been genuinely horrified to know their daughter would one day be internationally celebrated for embodying the very institution they taught her to distrust. Helen herself has always found the irony delicious rather than uncomfortable, a private joke between herself and the working-class rebellious household that raised her. Looking back across all of it now, the sun-scorched honesty of her Israeli kibbutz summer, the 4 passionate years with Liam Neeson that ended but somehow never fully closed, and the quiet, patient decades she has spent married to Taylor Hackford, a picture starts to form of exactly who Helen Mirren has always been. She has never treated love as something you either keep or lose completely. She has treated it as something you carry forward, piece by piece, into whoever you eventually become. That's really what she meant when she said she'll love Liam until the day she dies. It isn't a confession of unfinished business, and it certainly isn't a crack in a marriage that has already outlasted most in her industry. It's an admission that the people who shape us young never fully leave us, even when we build an entirely different, entirely happy life around someone else years later. At 81, with a marriage nearing its 30th year, a career spanning 2 Elizabeths, a Russian grandfather's stolen surname, and a summer in the Israeli sun, she never once stopped talking about Helen Mirren, has simply stopped pretending that a full, honest life only has room for one great love. The girl who hitchhiked across a country at war, the young woman who fell hard for an unknown Irish actor on a medieval film set, and the wife who has spent nearly 3 decades beside the same steady partner, are in the end all still the same person, refusing even now to edit any one of them out of her own story. She's finally let all of them sit together honestly out loud at once. And there's something quietly remarkable about a woman who, even at 81, still refuses to simplify her own heart for anyone's comfort. If this look behind the legend of Dame Helen Mirren moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.